I only have a short time with y'all today, and so I'll try to get to the meat of my experience in comprehensive sex education and tell you how I even got there. I'm originally from Brownsville, Texas, a very mostly Hispanic population that lives in Brownsville, and I came to the University of Texas in 1991, where I graduated with a bachelor's in psychology. During that time, I was asked to volunteer at an organization, and I decided to choose an organization called Algo Informicida in Austin, Texas. I believe they might still exist. And I did that because I had an uncle who identified as gay, and I never met him until the 80s when he came to visit us because he was dying because he had contracted the HIV virus. So I decided to join and volunteer the Austin Latina Gay Organization, who received funding to provide case management to people living with HIV, in particular people of color, and they also did prevention education. And I thought, well, if I get myself involved with this organization, I'll understand what my uncle went through and why he couldn't be with us in the Rio Grande Valley. So what I discovered was public health education, and it was risk reduction education. At first, I was uncomfortable with it, and I thought, well, you know, can't we just tell people to avoid some of this information? But I was told over and over again, no, this is the way they can do it safer. Because you see, risk avoidance education, or risk reduction education, is about relativism. It's about do not judge the individual for what they're doing. For example, when I was being taught how to reach out to teenagers, I was told to go to Planned Parenthood, which was right across the street. And at the time, the head of their education department was Dottie Curry. And she was a person from the community. She lived in the community and she educated in the community. And she began to tell me about the teenage problem with pregnancy and some of the horror stories of girls coming into the clinic with all forms of things that I really don't want to repeat, but shocked about what these girls were coming in with, not just diseases, but even objects and such in their bodies. And I said, you've convinced me, you need to tell me, how do I teach them not to have sex? And she said, no, dear. And she patted me on the knee and she said, we're not going to teach them not to have sex. We're going to teach them how to do it safer. We're going to meet them where they're at, and we're just going to teach them how to do it safer. And safer for them is condoms and lubrication. But they also talk about behavior change, and they say, well, a lot of people don't want to use condoms and lubrication because it doesn't feel good, or it doesn't, whatever the reasons are. So part of comprehensive sex education and risk reduction is to also teach them how pleasurable it is to use these types of things, condoms and lubrication. And it also means that we need to role play different ways that you can talk to your partner and convince them to use condoms and lubrication. And we're also taught that when we see a sea of people and teenagers, assume that they're doing everything. Don't ask them what they're doing, just assume that they're already doing it, which would include vaginal, anal, and oral sex. So we are to speak candidly to those teenagers about all forms of sex and how condoms and lubrication can help them, giving them a false message that they're going to be protected. I wasn't comfortable with doing this, but I was being taught by my leaders in the community, these experts at Planned Parenthood, that this was the only way, that there was no way that we could convince people not to have sex. There was no way we were going to convince children and adults not to have sex. So we just have to give them the resources, even if their parents don't want them to have it. Because what they told me is parents are a barrier to service. Once the parents know that this is happening, we'll never see them in the clinic again. So we need to let them know that it's safe to come here. So as I was being invited into different schools around East Austin mostly to talk about this with teenagers, I was literally, and this was back in the 90s, I was sneaked into the school. And the teachers would just wink at me and walk away, allowing me to say what I needed to say to the teenagers. So as I was speaking one day at an alternative school in East Austin, an alternative school means it's a school where, and let me also clarify if you don't know, in our area, the 613 or 623, I don't remember anymore, it was so long ago, East Austin was also primarily a people of color area. And so that's what we were always calling our outreach, was to people of color of childbearing age, men who have sex with men as well as the women. So I was brought into this alternative school where the children were high-risk youth, and they had been kicked out of many other schools, and so this was their last alternative, was to be at this school. And I was going to teach 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls about sex. And we had on the board written anal sex, vaginal sex, and oral sex. And the conversation began about what bodily fluids have HIV or STDs in them, other STDs. Then I got a question from a young girl, a 13-year-old girl, and she asked me, how do I provide oral sex? I'm going to clean up the language a little bit. How do I provide oral sex without gagging? And it took me back. I couldn't believe what this little girl was telling me or asking of me. I wasn't comfortable with it. And I said, can you repeat what you just asked? And she asked it again. She said, you know, I do this, but I get this reaction, and I just want you to teach me how to do it better. And I said, well, I think what I hear you saying is that this isn't something that you enjoy doing. She said, no, I don't. So if you teach me to do it better, then maybe I might enjoy it. I said, well, have you ever considered not doing it at all? If it's not something you enjoy, have you considered just not doing it? And all the kids just turned around in their seats. Now, these are high-risk kids. So if you can imagine, they're teenagers, you know, so they're already rowdy anyway. And they turn around and they look at me, and they're not mad. And Planned Parenthood always taught me that if I were to say something like that, obviously I'm judging them, so they're going to be upset, they're going to be closed off. But these kids didn't look closed off. They just looked at me, and all of a sudden they looked innocent. And I said, guys, do you realize you don't have to do any of this on the board? You don't have to have vaginal sex, anal sex, or oral sex. Have you ever considered that? And you know what the response was? No one's ever told us that. This education really does tell children to have sex. This is coming from the mouth of the youths. They're trusting us. They're trusting their teachers. They're trusting the clinics. They're trusting the adults to teach them. And if you tell them that this is the way of the world and this is the expectation, then that's what they're going to do. So then we didn't talk about prevention anymore. They started talking about, well, how do we stop having sex? One girl said, but I already started. How can I can't just stop now? I said, yeah, you can. And they were so calm, and they started talking about how they could support each other in deciding not to have sex. These are kids in an alternative school. They've been kicked out. I'm talking about kids that are just really a little out of control. All of a sudden, I had their attention. They really wanted to not have sex. I didn't have to tell them not to. I just suggested it. And they welcomed it. And they talked to each other about, hey, we don't really expect, the guys were like, we don't really expect that. We could just go watch a movie, or we could just go hang out. We could take a walk around the park. And it was amazing what I was hearing. I wasn't suggesting that. They were suggesting it. I spent 2 years volunteering for Planned Parenthood's Nobody's Fool in Waco, Texas. Nobody's Fool is a very large conference that was organized by Planned Parenthood. And they had in a huge conference, a convention center in Waco. And we had kids coming into middle school all the way to high school. And it was all going to teach them about risk reduction, using condoms, using lubrication, and how to negotiate the safer sex. They were all sectioned off in per age, and we were teaching the girls that were between 12 and 13 years of age. In that room where we had them, we had 3 teachers. One was going to teach them about puberty, their bodies. Another one was going to teach them about STDs, show them a video of actually teenagers who were, the opening scene is 2 teenagers in bed. You can tell they just finished having sex, and the rest of the video is about, oh, I got a disease, now I have to tell people, now I have to go to a clinic. And so the whole video is just about having sex. And then I chose to talk about healthy relationships. That first year, I left there convicted. I was so angry. I did not like what the kids were being taught. It did not settle well with me, and I was still invited to come back the next year. And I thought, I'm never going to go there again. But then I thought, you know what, this time I'm going to do it my way. And so I had the girls in my group, and I said, I'm going to do relationships again. We're going to talk about that again, and their futures. So I had the girls in my little group, and the other teachers were over to the side talking to their groups. But I started asking them, hey girls, so what do you want in life? What do you guys, tell me about your dreams. What do you want to be? And so I had volleyball player, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a dancer, I want to be a teacher, and these are just 12, 13-year-old girls, and they're just excited about it. Okay, great. That's great. Tell me about your best friend. Think about someone who you just trust, has your back, and no matter what you do, they're always there for you. Think about what is it about them that makes you feel that way and so safe about them. And so they started mentioning all the things that make them feel safe with this person, that they're honest and they always take care of them. And they're just going on and on about it. I'm like, okay, that's really good. I said, well, what about in dating relationships? So, y'all been talking about dating? And they started snickering. And I said, well, what should he look like? What should that guy look like? And they're like, I don't know. Well, do you think that maybe he could be a lot like your best friend or that person that you trust? That maybe he respects you? And they're like, yeah, he could. I could have him trust. Yeah, that would be good. It's like, yeah, so maybe the person you date is someone who admires you, respects you, protects you. Yeah. So they started thinking about that. I said, well, let's go back to your dreams then. Let's talk about that a little bit. So what would keep you from being that nurse or that volleyball player and all the things that y'all mentioned? And in the context of where we were, they said, well, being in an abusive relationship or getting pregnant. I'm like, yeah. I said, so what do you guys think you should do? Well, make sure we choose, the partners wisely, stay with your friends, or maybe don't date so quickly. I mean, they were coming up with all these answers themselves. I'm like, okay. And then one of them said, don't have sex? I said, maybe, but yeah, what about that? Well, one girl stood up and put her hands on her hips. She said, wait a minute. Do you want us to have sex or not? Of course, I knew the rest of the teachers were in the room with me, and I leaned in. I said, if it's up to me, if it were just up to me, I would say no. I want you to wait, and I want you to be that volleyball player, and I want you to be a nurse, and I want you to be a teacher, and I want you to have a healthy marriage. That's what I want for you. What I saw in those girls when I said that was relief. They relaxed. Their parents took them to this conference. They were driven there. They were dropped off there. And the girls, and these were girls that were just about to go into middle school, so I'm going to assume that they may not have gotten any education in the school yet. They already knew that they were coming into a conference that was going to teach them how to have sex. And when I started doing the presentation and getting them to answer these questions on their own, and they were getting the idea that maybe they shouldn't have sex, they knew that, hey, that doesn't jive with why we're here. They're smart. There's an organization, a liberal organization, that loves Planned Parenthood, the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. And they do a lot of research, they do a lot of polls among the teenagers. If you go to their website, you'll get an idea of what they teach. But one of the polls that they had was that teenagers reported that the person who influenced them most in their decision about having sex were parents. They said it themselves. It wasn't the teacher, it wasn't the clinic, it wasn't the nurse, it wasn't the expert, it was parents. One of my goals is to not only expose the truth of all of this and what the lies are, but to also teach parents that they need to talk to their children about these topics, and not about the graphic things, but just your expectations. When I got out of this field, I started wondering, why did I fall for this? Why did I spent 10 years working in HIV prevention, HIV case management, and then as a family planning training manager for all of Texas and New Mexico. And I thought, how did I not know that this wasn't right? Why did I allow them to mold me this way? My parents are married, they didn't get divorced. I came from a good family. Like, why did I do that? And I realized there was something that maybe, and I'm not blaming my parents, but they didn't talk to me about sex. They kind of, a roundabout way, said, oh, did you hear about, Consuela, she's got a baby now, and they were hoping that I would kind of listen to that and get the idea that, to avoid that. Or she should have taken care of herself. What does that mean? But they never talked to me about it. I never had my dad look at me and say, this is what I want for you because I admire you. I think you're beautiful. I want these things for you. I think that would have made a big difference for me. I had an older cousin that I really admired, and he once said, you know what, I think I'm going to live with someone instead of getting married, just to try it out first. That stayed in my mind. Those messages stayed in my mind. It's important that parents speak to their children, and one of the things I did with my son is I was always, even at a young age, anything that was important to him was important to me. And this is what I teach my stepdaughters when they've asked me about their kids and how to raise them. If your child comes up to you and wants to talk to you for an hour about a pencil that they received from their teacher as a prize or something at school, you stop and you listen to that. And I did that because I knew that when he became a teenager, he would not want to speak to me. But if he knew, if I had this habit that mom always listens and mom thinks I'm important and everything I think is important to her, then I knew that as a teenager, he would come to me and talk to me. And guess what? He did. He's 18 years old now. And I can tell at 18 that, there's some things he probably doesn't tell me, and that's okay. He's an adult. Things are a little different. But boy, that kid has told me so much, which is why my stepdaughters ask me, how did you raise your son? Because he's a great kid. My own mother says, how did you learn to do this? Because y'all are so close. Because parents, we need to put our phones down. We need, even if you're tired. I was a single mom for 9 years. You have to stop and sacrifice as parents and be there for your kids. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to do that, how I'm going to teach it, how I'm going to help change the culture, but that's one of my goals, and I hope you'll join me in that. Another important point, though, about Planned Parenthood that I want to emphasize and risk reduction education is that they truly believe that our teenagers have an insatiable appetite for sex. They don't think there's any way that you can stop it. And so that's why they need to continue giving your children condoms and lubrication and access to abortion. And they don't believe that your opinions and that your values for your children are important because they know better. And because you're old-fashioned. And like they've always said to me, parents are a barrier to service. So when a child goes into a Planned Parenthood, they can give a different name. They can give a friend's phone number. They're encouraged to do anything possible to keep secrets from their parents. And what do we teach our children when they're young? Secrets are not good. If there's an adult who tells you to keep a secret from your parents, that's a red flag. But yet that's what Planned Parenthood does. And they do it, and I think some of those people really think that they're helping. They do, because they're, mom is going to get really mad. And then she won't be able to come and get access to care. And then she's going to get pregnant. I mean, they really do believe that. But if you think about it, a lot of the ways that they teach the education, how they groom the kids, one of the first exercises in this kind of education is to have them list all of the slang terms for sex and body parts. And it's uncomfortable. And they giggle, but they're still told to do it. That is breaking down inhibitions. It's very similar to grooming for child sexual abuse. Do they see it that way? Did I see it that way? No, we didn't. But I see it that way now, and I know you do too. It's really important that we let parents know what this education is really like, and that these organizations exist based on their secrets. A year before I left, I went to a human trafficking conference because I just wanted to. I knew it was an important topic. It was back in probably 2008 or so here in Austin. And I learned all about human trafficking and how to identify a victim of human trafficking. And my boss at the time, the organization called Center for Health Training, who had the Title X training grant, said, "Sure, go ahead, go do that." So I attended that conference. A year later, the Title X grant actually had as a key concept that we needed to identify, the clinicians needed to learn how to identify victims of human trafficking. So I was like, perfect, I went to a training, I'm going to teach that. So I went to Corpus Christi because Planned Parenthood always had enough money to pay for me to go and visit them and train them all on their own. So I was in Corpus Christi at a hotel in a big conference room teaching them about Title X requirements, And then I started talking about human trafficking. I said, you know, when a teenager comes in or a young girl comes in and you just kind of get that feeling she's not really with her dad, or, you know, and you just kind of have this feeling it's someone that, either someone who's trafficking her, it's a pimp, or someone who's having sex with her, and, you know, then, and you know what I'm talking about, is what I told them. I said, that is also considered human trafficking. Statutory rape, human trafficking. And it was a room about this big. And they all were just like, no, shaking their heads. I said, well, you know, this young girl is vulnerable. She doesn't know how to tell you, you know, what's happening. You need to use your counseling skills to be able to get this information from her and protect her. They started giggling and dismissing what I was saying. I said, I don't understand this reaction. Can you tell me, you know, guys, this is real. This is human trafficking, you know. And a nurse raised her hand and she said, honey, if she's not sleeping with this guy this much, she'll be with another one next month. And they all said, yeah. They don't see our children as human anymore. They don't. And a common phrase was, don't ask, don't tell, like in the military for homosexuality. If you don't ask them, then you don't have to tell. And they love using that. If I don't ask the girl how old she is or who she's having sex with, then I don't have to tell. And they actually think they're doing this girl a favor. Our communities are at risk. These evidence-based interventions that they say are effective or based on evidence, they're not. They're based on self-report. I challenged them about that in the 90s when I went to a training on when the CDC first put out evidence-based interventions. Said, guys, what's the evidence for this? And they said, self-report. I said, seriously? That's it? Just because someone walked in and said, yeah, you taught me to use them and I've used them 3 out of 5 times, that's evidence-based? It wasn't until a couple of years ago that Ascend and the HHS actually admitted that these interventions are not working and that they're not scientifically sound. And that made me very angry, because I was teaching that since the 90s in communities that are dying. And the CDC is actually telling us to use these evidence-based interventions and supporting it and defending it all these years, while the people in our own community, just on the other side of 35, are dying. If you look up the statistics for the CDC and the STD rates in 2016, those STD rates are still increasing. They have not declined. Our children are still at risk, mainly 15 to 24-year-olds and men who have sex with men. This education hasn't helped. It is meeting them where they're at, like Dottie Curry told me to do, but it's also to leave them there. Why is it that we've decided that when it comes to sex, that we just want to let people continue being in high-risk behaviors? We have other health models like smoking cessation. It's like, avoid it, don't do it. Don't do drugs. But when it comes to sex, it's, oh, put a condom on it. Statistics also show that children, young people who have sex early, are more likely not only to have diseases, get pregnant, they won't do as well in school, which has nothing to do with becoming pregnant, and also have higher rates of depression. Those children who have chosen to avoid sex have higher grades, are more likely to go into higher institutions of learning, and are healthier. You can look it up for yourself. It's not a secret. So why is it that we have all this evidence, but yet we continue to do this education? I don't know, but it's going to take people like you and organizations like Texas Alliance for Life to help stop it, because this kind of education is what's also leading to the abortions that we are fighting against. Abortion is always the only option for these organizations.
That's right.
When I asked them, when I started to question the education, and when I started to question innocently, I was like, guys, have you noticed that we really do promote abortion? They're like, what are you talking about? I said, no, really. We really do. We don't have adoption people at our conferences. We don't ever talk about abstinence except for the one sentence that says it's the only 100% way to avoid pregnancy and STDs. And after that, we just talk about sex. Have you ever noticed that we really promote abortion? And I'm like, Monica, what are you talking about? they were realizing that I was changing, and I was realizing what was really happening. I was told by my supervisor before I left, if you're not pro-choice, you don't belong here. And this was an organization that was funded to provide training for Title X. I don't know how to fix it, but I know I can't do it all on my own, just like Joe can't do it all on his own. We need your help. One of the things movement I want to start is that it takes a family. It takes a family to raise children. It takes a family to build healthy communities, and it takes a family to form a great nation. And that's what we need to focus on. We need to clean up our schools. We need to hold our clinicians accountable. We need to set up proper legislation. But even with legislation, we need to hold each other accountable. And we need to find a way to change the culture through the families. And we know that the other side knows this because they're putting these curriculums starting pre-K. They know that if they get to our children, that they're going to change the culture. And they're doing it. So we can't be passive, and we can't just be meeting together. We need to go out into the community and make a difference, however you can. One of the things that has come to my attention as well is that people like me, you either like me right now or you still hate me because of what I used to do. But I want to read something to you that as I was preparing for this, I thought, God, what do you need me to say? And this is in Jonah. But God said to Jonah, do you have a right to be angry about the vine? I do, he said. I am angry enough to die. If you remember, Jonah was asked to go to Nineveh to show God's grace because they were a lost people. And Jonah didn't want to do it. He was angry. He didn't want them to have grace. He wanted punishment for them. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who could not tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? Organizations like And Then There Were None, and many of you know that praying for these educators, praying for the clinicians is important. I don't know who prayed for me, but someone prayed for me and helped me get out of this. And God convicted me and helped me to see, because all of the proof was right there, but I couldn't see it. I didn't know my left hand from my right. Grace and compassion does not mean that we leave people where they're at. Grace and compassion founded in truth leads us to great paths, and it's going to take courage and it's going to take work. I'd like to open this up for any questions that you may have. I'm sure you're curious.